Well, welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today is another Q&A with some great people. And our topic is being at ease with others. As usual, our participants have watched that podcast and you can see it or listen to it at my website, drchris.life. And I'll do a quick summary of it now before we jump into our Q&A. At some level, we're all potentially afraid of other people, and they can be potentially afraid of us. Fear of others is merely the dark side of our extraordinary sociality, our joy in connecting with those around us, and our dependency on others to survive, let alone thrive. It also reflects our evolutionary past, in which strangers were probably initially to be regarded as enemies, until they prove themselves to be friends. Another aspect of this general nervousness is our need for predictability and consistency in others. We want to be able to predict that things will be fine between us. When we aren't in this kind of social synchrony, we can feel quite discombobulated. Nowhere is this more apparent than when we encounter people who have personality disorders, who, by definition, exhibit marked deviations from social norms. A common experience in the presence of someone with a personality disorder is for us to feel really uncomfortable, nauseous even, or even inexplicably afraid. There are many implications of these insights. One is that we should have a compassionate understanding of these insecurities in ourselves and in others. We should also take care to actively set people at ease, soothing their natural self-protective discomfort. Now, should we automatically trust everyone? By no means. Nonetheless, it is best to operate from a default of trust until proven otherwise, as generally trust begets trust. So the best strategy in dealing with others is to appeal to the better angels of their nature. Righto, so to our Q&A. And welcome, guys. You've all listened to the podcast, Being at Ease with Others. And as usual, I'm mightily curious about your insights and questions. And if past experience is any indication, that these lead to interesting, if not curly, questions. So who's to kick off?
I'm happy to jump into it, Dr. Chris.
Okay.
More of an observation, not necessarily a question. Yep. You're talking about operating from a default of trust. That really just kind of made me think of, we've been doing a ton of hiring over the last 18 months in our organization, and where I'm finding or noticing where we have managers that are operating from that kind of level of trust, a little bit more success with the new hire. Where someone is a little bit more on the side of micromanaging was more of an opportunity for failure. So just when you talked about that operating from a default of trust, it really resonated in that situation for me.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We don't often think about what our impact on others is. You know, we tend to see when people behave around us that they're behaving solely out of their characteristics. We don't necessarily think that the way that people manifest or show up is conjointly a function of me and the space I create, as well as their characteristics. So a way of thinking about that is that rather than think that there's sort of like a unitary self in here, we might think that there's a repertoire of selves, and that we can elicit certain aspects of a person, certain features of them that might be more useful, for example, right? So it's a very powerful insight when we begin to understand that the way people show up around us is not purely a function of the way they are. Of course, they have characteristics, But you probably know that, you might be talking to a friend or a colleague about a third party, and one person's saying, oh, they're a wonderful person. They're just so lovely. And the other person's, really? I found them really difficult. And probably both people are right. So this is an enormous power. How do we draw the best out of people, right? And trust is the way, right? And, I've talked in the past about giving people the 3 experiences of being heard, understood, and accepted. When we do that, people feel trusted, they relax, and they bring forth the better aspects of their nature, right? And this is mutual, of course. If a person feels untrusted, then they won't trust the manager, right? And it sets up a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy. So this is why they pay you the big bucks, Karen, because you're trying to manage the most complex things in the universe, i.e. people interacting with other people. Yeah. Fantastic.
Thank you.
What else, guys?
I had a similar thought process, and was really around that notion of trust, but also there's sort of 2 muscles that we're talking about developing here, right? There is being at ease with people that might not otherwise put you at ease. There's also creating an environment that puts others at ease with you.
Yes.
Is it fair to say that working one of those actually helps with the other and vice versa?
I've never thought about it that way, Chris, and often your questions lead me to that conclusion. I think probably the answer is yes. So let's sort of work our way through it. We might start with creating an environment of trust, building that muscle. And this relates to the conversation Karen and I just had. That if you create an environment of trust, then people, generally speaking, are going to show up in a way that's more trustworthy. Right. So rather than thinking about can a person be trusted, it's more like are we creating the conditions for a person to be trustworthy? In economics, for example, in behavioral economics, they talk about what they call crowding in and crowding out public ethics. In other words, if you send a message, even if you might be offering a reward, for people to do something, sometimes it actually brings about the opposite behaviour because people intuit, oh, yeah, I can't be trusted just to do the right thing. I've got to be bribed, right? So it actually crowds out unwittingly what it's trying to do. So creating an environment where people feel trusted crowds in their, if I can put it that way, their trustworthiness. Now, the other muscle, the dealing with one's own lack of trust. I think the central insight there is, well, of course, if you're creating an environment out there where people start behaving better and more trustworthy, that's going to reduce our own anxiety immediately. Yeah, but I think there's another dimension of this, and that is, one of the things I'm always trying to do, in the work that I do with people, is to help them understand what I call the disproportionality of their concerns. So, if you take an evolutionary psychology perspective, you ask the question, why do people worry so much? Why is social threat such a threat? And I think in our ancestral past, it would have actually been more realistic. That it would have been actually an existential threat, and that being rejected from the village would have been a death sentence, or seeing someone from a different tribe who you don't know would potentially end your existence. Yeah. right? And so that's the nervous system that we, by and large, operate out of. And I think so most of our social fears are wildly disproportionate, like whether it's on social media or in the office or in our relationships, it feels like it's just the worst thing in the world. So knowing that can help us go, oh, I see. That's just my Stone Age wiring. And then, of course, as you relax around people, they relax. And we get into the business of cooperation and then mutual altruism. And we're now in a non-zero sum game. We're in a win-win situation. Yeah. But thank you. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it, exercising these two muscles. Yeah, fantastic. And what about
letting go of that need for controlling your environment?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've got some thoughts on that, but just what's in your mind there, Colleen?
Well, I think not letting people in or not being at ease is because you can't control what the other person is going to do, or you can't control the environment.
Yeah. And you're right. This is a really fundamental thing in our design, that one way of thinking about all the ways in which we're designed is we're trying to anticipate the environment, i.e., so that we can control, in particular, for negative eventualities and negative stuff, but also to engineer positive stuff, right? So, and the hardest, probably most impossible task is to control others, right? But you're right. The whole issue of interpersonal control is about, well, if I can't trust, can I control? So, if you're talking about a manager micromanaging, what are they doing? They're trying to reduce the ambiguity, reduce the uncertainty by controlling. But of course, that has a very deleterious effect on the person being controlled. And it really limits what they can contribute to exactly what is being asked for. Right. And in most cases, what you're losing there is all the discretional effort, all the creativity, all the extra stuff that manager hasn't realized is possible. Right. So you'll only ever then get what the manager thinks is what they need. What's the point of having a team of diverse people if that's the way we work? Yeah, so interesting. Terry, have you got any thoughts?
It was really interesting when you and Chris were having your back and forth. It definitely reminded me of your younger self walking into that elevator with the ice cream cone at 8 a.m. and then not just walking in, but then turning around and looking at everybody.
We probably should tell the listeners what the hell you're referring to.
Well, hopefully they've listened to the podcast that we're talking about.
Well, they may not have yet. So,
well, this will make them.
Yeah, I mean, what Terry's referring to was a kind of experiment I ran, in which I got into a crowded elevator early in the morning at in a workplace with an ice cream cone, a double cone, and people thought that was very strange, of course, and but it became scary when I then turned and faced people in the elevator and offered them a lick of the ice cream. And why I did that's a story for another day, but the fear, you could see the whites of their eyes, if I could put it that way. The space opened out. And I realized how fundamental this fear of the uncertainty of other people is. I didn't do anything aggressive or nasty, but I think they were pretty worried, or at least a lot of people. So what were you thinking about that, Terry?
So that made me think about, social norms versus culture norms.
Yeah.
Because what might be acceptable and normal in one culture might not be in the other.
Yes.
And seeing how the world is so integrated, which is great, and seeing how it's so diverse with different cultures, especially in urban centers, then how does one account for that?
Yeah, okay. So I think there's a difference here. Like, I mean, in one way, what psychology looks at, it sort of has two broad branches. You know, one we call individual differences, and the other, I guess, you might call general psychology. And the idea is, in what ways are we all the same, and in what ways are we different? And I think in the same way, you could talk about a general social psychology, but then you would also talk about the way that then plays out in different cultures. So what we have in common is, you know, a need to cooperate, a need to feel safe with other humans, a need to survive, you know, biological needs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In a sense, it doesn't matter what cultural form that takes. You know, every cultural form is an attempt to help the group prosper, right? And there's many ways of organising prospering, right? But here's the thing, Terry. If you're in a culture that's developed norms, cultures, ways of going about things, then we all learn that together, and that makes us feel safe. It makes us feel secure. It's predictable. We're in a dance together. Then someone comes along, say someone with a personality disorder, and they're singing from a completely different hymn sheet. They're not on the same page. They operate in ways that are discombobulating in the sense of, I can't anticipate this person's moves. Any human in any culture is going to find that disturbing, right? It's because we learn a culture, it then becomes what we take for granted. It's invisible. It's the water we swim in. Now suddenly we feel like we've been flipped out of the water, right? So yes, there are cultural differences, but I think sitting underneath that is a common psychology and common psychological needs, you know, that I think, but both are super important. You can't understand one without the other, because there's no human who's not embedded in culture. Does that make sense? Well, yeah. As usual, you've stretched me to the limit with the questions. You know, it is I think a very, very personally relevant, interesting subject, this one. The way in which, when you begin to notice how much of our behaviour is determined by this unease around people, and what an active role we actually have in changing the odds of our social interactions by proactively taking care of this concern in other people. That when we do that, it's a win-win, because it then creates an environment in which I can relax. You know, so it's definitely a win-win. All right, guys, terrific. I look forward to our next one. Not sure what our next topic's going to be, but I'm sure your contributions will make it worthwhile. So I'll see you then. Bye, guys.